that I see here this morning, and I look forward to this great workshop. I must start by saying that, in fact, by acknowledging all of you, as I said, but also more importantly, the Deputy CEO for Electoral Operations at the IEC, Mr. Maseko Shiburi, and who will also give us a presentation later. I think his presence here underlines the importance of the partnership that we as the South African National Editors Forum share with the IEC in making sure that as we approach the elections, that our journalists are better equipped, that they have the necessary information and knowledge to be able to unpack and also understand how elections work. And this workshop is the first of a number of workshops, and it's also a culmination of the hard work that has been spearheaded by our chairperson of the Access to Information and Media Policy Committee, Isaac Minar, and also our chairperson for the Media Freedom Committee, Mary Papaya. And as we start this workshop, I think it's important that we begin with the fundamentals, which is why this workshop is titled aptly as it's how elections work. And it should be able to help us to navigate those waters. At the end of this workshop, we hope that you will be able to understand the constitutional and legislative framework for our elections, but also more importantly, to understand how our voting system works, how our hybrid system works, and that at the end of this workshop, you should also be able to understand the role and the functions of electoral institutions. And I think it's also important that as we go out there, we also understand and we know the things that we should look out for in an election. And I know that time and again as journalists, we interact with a lot of people and we face a number of challenges. So it should be important then as you come out of these workshops, that you should be able to even challenge respectfully so, even those who are in authority. You know that sometimes people flout the rules or throw their weight around with the necessary knowledge that you would have gained from these workshops. I know someone will ask as to why we're having an election workshop when we do not know when the election date will be. Well, the reality is that whether the election is today or whether it's next year, the knowledge that you would have gained from these webinars and also the upcoming workshops will be able to benefit the participants, not just to understand the upcoming election, but also its information that they can use in future. As I said earlier, there will be 7 of these webinars, which will be spread out over the next few weeks and the next months. Colleagues, the reason why we organized these workshops is because we understand and also we don't take lightly our role, which is to empower citizens with information and also to promote our democratic values. That is the role of the media. It's not the role of SANEF. It's the role of the media. It's our collective role as journalists. And we also know that for any democracy to thrive, it not only requires the 3 arms of the state, rather it requires a free and independent and a skilled media fraternity. And it's important that we always understand that for the democratic machine to work, the media is an important cog in that regard. But more importantly, this training cuts across all media. And at the end of all of this training, which will include, today we're starting with the first workshop, but we'll also do things like understanding how finances work, how municipal finances work. And I think that's an important one, which will help us unpack and also be able to read those documents. As you know, that most of the information is hidden in the numbers. And sometimes we're unable as journalists to decode that. So these workshops should be able to equip us in that regard. But the most important thing that I think we must walk away from, not just this workshop, but the rest of the workshops that are upcoming, is to understand that elections are not about political parties. Elections are about the people. So as we go out there, as we head out to those different communities, it is important that we always keep that in mind, and that as we tell those stories, we tell them from the perspective of those communities. It must be about their issues, it must be about their lives, and it must be about their localities. And with all the tools that you'd have gained from here, and also from our election portal. We did launch an election portal in July, and it has all the information we require and all the information about all the wards in this country. It is an interactive tool that you can use, and it will help enhance your reporting as you go into these areas, ladies and gentlemen. And I think lastly, as I wrap, it's just once again to reiterate that as journalists, we have faced a very difficult period, particularly over the lockdown period. And we know that political parties tend to be a bit hostile towards elections. So we will be working with the IEC in terms of the code of conduct, and also hoping that political parties will be able to commit to ensuring that the environment is safe for journalists as we go forward. With those few words, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome all of you to this workshop, and I hope that as you walk away, you will be better equipped and have a better understanding of how our elections work. Thank you very much, Hopewell, and over to you.
And without wasting any more time, I think my colleague will upload the slides of Mr. Mashego Shiburi's presentation. Thank you. And I'm not going to waste any more time. I'm going to ask him to please address us. And thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. The platform is yours.
Good morning, colleagues, and thank you for the opportunity. One, to speak to the fraternity that is responsible for bridging the information gap in packaging newsworthy matters in a manner that is accessible to consumers of the news. But also because you have a very important duty in shaping public discourse, and that can be overemphasized in the era of dis and misinformation. I have prepared a number of slides for information and to give structure to our discussions this morning. I do not intend to deal with each of those slides because the intention is to allow for discussions that will arise from questions and discussions so that this engagement is meaningful to you. The structure of the input is as follows. I'll try in a few minutes to deal with how elections work, touch on the new things that we'll be experiencing for the first time in these elections. And I know there will be topical issues, and I will deal with those towards the end of the presentation. Let's see. The slide before you demonstrates that planning for an election commences way ahead of voting day. And there are key things to be said from this slide. In 2018, the Municipal Demarcation Board completed municipal outer boundary redetermination process. In other words, the MDB concluded that the boundaries that were applicable in 2016 when we went for our election will remain extant until after the 2021 local government elections. So there were no adjustments to the outer boundaries, no new municipal configurations. It was just technical adjustment within the boundaries of the municipality. I raise this to illustrate the following, that owing to the decision not to change new boundaries, there will be grievances that would have been registered in 2016 by certain communities, and those grievances will still be relevant in the lead up to these elections. For an example, we know the situation in Vuwani where some communities are not happy with the new municipal boundaries there. Similarly, in the Northern Cape, Gamutibi, Also in Mpumalanga, the Palising, we know that people wanted their municipality to be redetermined out of the province of Mpumalanga and into Gauteng. Those things have not happened. So those things will be the environment within which the elections, as and when they are held, will be held in that environment. The next thing to be said on this slide is that the MDB commenced its public processes to determine new ward boundaries for municipalities in February 2020. And that process was interrupted, as we know, by COVID-19, the result of which is that the MDB was delayed in handing over to the Electoral Commission the ward boundaries. So the ward boundaries were only handed over in December 2020. What that means is that the Electoral Commission needed to adjust its planning for elections by a factor of 3 to 4 months to accommodate the time lost by the MDB in dealing with the ward boundaries. This slide summarizes the key milestones for this election. The first one is that having received the ward boundaries from the MDB, the Electoral Commission commenced between October and March this year with a process of aligning voting districts to new ward boundaries. In other words, the MDB is responsible for the wards, and inside the wards, there are a number of voting districts, which we use as a basis of compiling the voters' roll. And each of those voting districts must locate within a ward. So we looked at the new ward boundaries and made a determination of how those ward boundaries have impacted on our network of voting districts. And in March, we concluded the work. We followed that by a process of targeted communication and registration. As the name suggests, would target communities of voting districts where people's registration may have been impacted by the change in the ward. For example, before the MDB process, you may have been in Ward 23 in the city of Johannesburg. The MDB has changed the ward boundaries, and now you find yourself in a ward other than in which you were registered. So that is the communication that we needed to undertake with communities in those wards and to re-register those persons correctly in the new ward segments. In June this year, we launched the elections, and we also announced the period of voter registration, which was scheduled for July. We already know that those two opportunities for registrations had to be deferred owing to the onset of the third wave of the coronavirus. We're meant to have the registration weekend over the weekend of the 17th, over the weekend of the 18th and 19th of July. We deferred that to the weekend of the 31st of July and the 1st of August. But because owing to the third wave of the pandemic, we have had to defer that registration weekend. We already know also that the minister responsible for cooperative governance and traditional affairs has determined by way of proclamation that elections will be held on the 27th of August. That proclamation was issued on the 3rd of August 2021. And there are two important obligations that arise from proclamation for the Electoral Commission. The first is that the voters' roll closed on that day. At midnight on the 3rd of August, the voters' roll for these elections closed. So people who register now, by all means, we will register them because registration is continuous. But if they are registering for the first time, they will not have their names reflected on the voters' roll if the elections proceed on the 27th of October. The second important obligation is that immediately after proclamation, the Electoral Commission needed to publish an election timetable. And as the name suggests, a timetable includes activities that must be undertaken, and the cutoff time within which those activities must be undertaken leading up to the elections on the 27th of October. The key thing for that in that timetable for the month of August is that political parties and independent candidates who wish to contest the elections must, by no later than 1700 hours on the 23rd of August, submit their list of candidates or their nomination details. If a party fails to meet that deadline, that party will not be able to participate in the elections. Similarly, independent candidates that do not meet that deadline will not have their name appear on the ballot paper for this election. By way of information, this slide I can skip because I've already I can deal with it in the summary. And the summary is as follows, that for these elections, we will have 4,468 wards across the country. What that means is that there will be at least 4,468 unique elections in those wards, because a ward can be contested by a candidate representing a party, or it can be contested by a candidate who stands independent of a party. So a ward ballot paper will never be the same as a ward ballot paper anywhere else, even in the same municipality, because the people contesting in those things, in those wards, are different. The number of municipalities have not changed because the MDB has not changed the outer boundaries. This slide just demonstrates that with each election, the number of wards increase. We started with 3,794, and now we are at 4,468 for the 2021 elections. 3,794 in 2000 are first democratically held local government elections, and the number of wards have increased since then. The next slides indicate that the number of municipalities have remained unchanged since 2016. So the geography of elections have not significantly changed. The wards may have increased, but the outer boundaries of municipalities have not changed. We remain still with 8 metropolitan municipalities, which are going to be the battleground for the contesting political parties. We have 205 local municipalities or category B municipalities, and we have 44 district municipalities. I pause on this slide to demonstrate that the number of councillor seats has increased nominally from the councillor seats in 2016. While in 2016, the total seats that were available in all municipalities across the country were 10,285. The number has increased to 10,478, which is a 1.9% increase in the number of seats that are available. So the story from this slide is as follows. While the number of seats are finite, 10,478, the number of contestants is likely to increase substantially. So the number of contestants or persons vying for the seats is almost double the number of seats available. In 2016, in excess of 63,000 candidates submitted their nominations to contest a finite number of 10,285 seats. What that means is that when the results are announced, you have more people who have lost an opportunity to be a councillor, to be employed, to draw a salary. And that has the potential to set a negative tone related to the outcome of results, because people may have used their last money to submit their candidature, and if you don't reach a threshold of support by voters, you forfeit that amount. And if more people lose an opportunity to get a seat, the narrative will become negative. The next slide talks to the voters' roll. And the message to be said here is that with each election, we have an increase in the number of persons registered as voters. But if we were to go to the elections in 2021 on the 27th of October, we will do that for the first time with a net reduction or net decrease in the voters' roll. This is so because it is not a new phenomenon, but in the period in between elections, there's a net decline on the voters' roll owing to the rate of mortality. So in between elections, we lose people on the voters' roll. We only recover when a registration weekend is called, when an election is imminent. We estimate before the COVID period, we estimate that on average, we lose between 32,000 and 35,000 persons from the voters' roll owing to death on a monthly basis. There has been a slight increase in the number in the rate of mortality since COVID. In the earlier days, when HIV and AIDS were still a factor, we lost on average about 45,000 persons on the voters' roll every month. That figure has come down. It has settled at around 30, 32, 35,000 rate of death per month. So this slide communicates an important thing, that going into an election without the Electoral Commission having organized a general voter registration means that people who wanted to register would not have had an opportunity. Because they are not registered as voters, they are unable to vote. This, we think, is an unreasonable limitation on the political rights guaranteed in Section 19 of the Constitution. Similarly, if a person is registered, they've not been able to update their registration details, they may not be able to stand as a candidate in the election because they may be registered in the municipality in which they do not intend to contest. Again, a well-entrenched reality remains that we have more female registered as voters than males. Similarly, we have more females who participate in elections than their male counterparts. And from our perspective as an election management body, we have more persons working in the administration of elections who are female more than male. However, the trend does not perpetuate when you look at persons who are elected into offices. There are more public representatives who are male than female, and that inverts the trend that we have on the voters' roll, especially for ward elections. And ward elections, because ward elections are a winner-take-all elections. So whoever gets the most votes wins that election. Women tend to fare much worse in those elections than their male counterparts. What has assisted in having a fairer representation of females in public office is that the parties, especially parties who are left-leaning, have institutionalized some form of equity of representation among their list. And that has tended to push the rate of females who find themselves as elected councillors up. But that is primarily on the PR ballot, i.e. the proportional representation ballot, which is submitted by political parties. The next slide gives us the voters' roll by the different age cohorts. And again, a worrying reality here is that we all know that South Africa, consistent with the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, is increasingly a young nation. However, on the voters' roll, the youth are underrepresented on the voters' roll. We do not ascribe that to apathy. We're thinking that we should look first at our administrative environment to see if there are any administrative requirements that militate against participation of young persons? Are there any barriers in the representation of young persons that we as an election management body can address in order to reverse the underrepresentation of young persons on the voters' roll? The point that needs to be said that once registered, though, young persons are more likely, in fact, 10 times more likely to vote than any age cohort. So it won't be utterly correct to say there's apathy on the part of young persons. They are not engaged with the affairs of their country. To the contrary, we have found that once registered, young persons are more likely to participate in elections than any other age cohort. This slide just represents what I've been saying in a different format. The slides now talks to the voters' roll and addresses. You will recall that in 2016, ahead of the local government elections, the Electoral Commission was at the Constitutional Court owing to a case brought by the case of more commonly known as Mhlope, where independent candidates in Tlokwe had challenged the Electoral Commission that it had failed in its constitutional obligation to ensure that voters appear with addresses on the voters' roll. When we appeared before court in March 2016, only about 34% of voters appeared on the voters' roll with addresses against their names. Fast forward to March this year, we have increased the address situation on the voters' roll from 34% to about 94%. Even with our best wishes and endeavor, we accept that we'll never reach 100% address situation on the voters' roll because we know the settlement patterns in the country, the rate of inequality, the rate of informal settlements, and those type of things. So we'll never reach 100%, but our effort is to make sure that we have an address or a description of a place of ordinary residence for every person who is registered as a voter. And the key things that the court said were important for an address were two. One, that an address serves to facilitate canvassing by contestants. In other words, if a voter has an address, it is easier for a candidate, independent or party candidate, to go knock at their door using that address to canvass or harass them, as the case may be. Secondly, the significance of an address is to make sure that only persons who are ordinarily resident in the geographic space within which an election are held can participate in those elections. And to the converse, it must keep out all other persons that are not entitled to participate in those elections. The slides that follow, I won't go through them. They just demonstrate that there is a narrative to the no address phenomenon. In other words, it seems to coexist with areas of high densities and areas where we had Bantustans. So you'll see in the former Bantustans in the Eastern Cape, in parts of Mpumalanga, in parts of Limpopo, the no address phenomenon is more prevalent there. And in the western part of the country, the address situation is not a problem. In the Western Cape and in the Northern Cape, we tend to have more persons appearing on the voters' roll than we do in the eastern part of the country, where we had a lot of Bantustan. So I'll skip these slides and come to the changes, things that are new for these elections. The first one is that Parliament has passed amendments to the electoral system, to the Electoral Act, to the Municipal Electoral Act, and to the Electoral Commission Act. I must hasten to add that these amendments do not address the findings and the order made by the Constitutional Court in June last year. that the Electoral Act is unconstitutional to the extent that it only facilitates the participation in election through membership of a political party. So these amendments do not address the findings and the order of the Electoral Court. These are amendments required to facilitate proper administration of local government election. They had already been in the parliamentary system even before the court made its decision in June 2020. That process has been dealt with by the Minister of Home Affairs, and I think imminently he should be able to sponsor legislative amendment in Parliament. So the changes that we've made deal with the increase in the registration level of political parties. Hitherto, the law only permitted a party to be registered at a national level or at a municipal level. So you found that there were interest groups that had no intention of contesting elections nationally. Their issues are localized, they are local, and they want to only contest in that geographic area or district or province. So we've made it possible for parties to register now at the district and at a provincial level. The more substantive amendment that we've made to the law is the one highlighted on this page. In other words, we're making it clear as an election management body that voters for whom we still do not have an address are still entitled to participate in elections. So a person without an address is still entitled to vote. But in order that we keep true to the order in Mhlope in 2016 by the Concord, we have amended the law to make it peremptory, that a voter who appears on the voter's roll without an address must first supply the address before they are permitted to vote. And if that address locates in the ward in which they are registered, that voter will vote like any other voter at that voting station. We're also dealing here with clarifying the effective date of the Electoral Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct is binding only from the date on which an election is proclaimed up to the day on which the elections are, the results are released. And this is so because the effect of the Code of Conduct is to limit certain rights that persons and parties ordinarily enjoy. So it is not preferable that the rights of persons and or entities are limited for inordinate periods of time. So we're clarifying that the Code of Conduct is binding on the party and its candidates and independent candidates only from the date on which an election is proclaimed and until such time that the results are made known. In other words, the Code of Conduct must be linked to an election period, because outside of an election period, anyone who's not happy with the conduct of a party or its leader will have other remedies in law other than relying on the Code of Conduct. The last point on this slide is very key, in that we are bringing the law, the electoral scheme, in line with the requirement for Protection of Personal Information Act. In other words, we are making sure that the information, the voter information, personal information of voters that we process, we do so in a minimalist way. So what do we mean by this? The Electoral Commission is under an obligation to publish a voter's roll. So once this act comes into force, the voter's roll that we make available to parties or to any person who has paid a fee will no longer include the full ID number of voters. We will maintain the first 6 digits of the voter on the voter's roll, because it is important, if I want to object, to know almost the age of a person is important, so that I can tell if this is the person against which I wish to make an objection, if people share a name on the voter's roll. So once the act is proclaimed into law, we will redact the ID number of a voter, unless a person who requires a voter's roll can make out a case to indicate that they require more digits to be disclosed so that they can distinguish among a number of voters who have a same name. Similarly, we are trying to reduce the likelihood of any person laying their hands on the voter's roll. Now, there are requirements. A person must indicate that they require a voter's roll for journalistic purposes, for scholarly endeavor, for research purposes, or for work related to an election. So we have removed the unfettered access to anyone to a copy of the voter's roll on payment of a prescribed fee. The next slide, we're just dealing with the key messaging that will underpin our preparation for elections. The one will be work that we do in collaboration with community radio stations, work that we do out of necessity on social media as a result of COVID-19, on the importance of participation by each citizen, the how to register and update voter registration information, and the where and the how of voting. So those messages we will persist with. We will, however, migrate most of them onto social media platforms and into community radio platforms. The other key messaging will be to communicate the measures that the Commission has implemented to safeguard the public health of voting public, electoral staff, observers, and party agents, in that to communicate to people that you can come out and vote in circumstances of relative safety. Voting in an election would not necessarily expose you to more risk than ordinarily would be the case. The last message is around how we deal with disinformation, particularly as it relates to the election. We are once again partnering with Media Monitoring Africa and the social media platforms so that we can put capacity to investigate postings that are false, and also be able to have a channel with those platforms for the takedown of those misleading information. Again, we have had to relook at our criteria for electoral staff, and I think here there's a point to be made on this next slide. That point is ahead of each election, we get accusations from certain political parties that go along these lines, that the Electoral Commission recruits SADTU members and SADTU is in alliance with a political party, and therefore those people will not administer elections in a free and fair manner. How we employ people is as follows. We have a criteria on the recruitment of electoral staff that we have developed in conjunction with political parties. At the heart of the criteria is to keep persons who are partisan from being employed as electoral staff. So we look at a person's history, for example. The person cannot have been a candidate in the last 5 years for a political party. The person cannot hold an elected executive position in a political party. Other than that, every South African is free to apply for a position as electoral staff. And before we confirm those staff, we provide the names to political parties at the local level for them to go look at the suitability of those persons. And if they think a person is not politically acceptable, they can raise an objection in terms of the criteria. And if that objection is sustained, that person will be removed from the list of persons used as electoral staff. For registration, we employ just under 60,000 persons for those 2 days. And for the election, we increase those number of persons to 200,000. Since the past 2 elections, we have looked purposefully at offering opportunities to young persons who may have graduated but are not employed, And so over an election period, you see that the age cohort of our electoral staff is reducing. However, we still require some level of maturity in the 3 key positions that are responsible for managing the voting stations. And there we have an additional requirement that the person must have some form of administrative or supervisory experience. We introducing a new voter management device. We have procured and received 40,000 such units. These units will be used twofold. The first use is to register voters. And the significance of this procurement is that this device will replace the old zip-zip machine. The zip-zip served us very well, but its technology is dated. It was used for its time, but the requirements of a voter's roll since the Constitutional Court judgment in 2018 have changed significantly. So the device will enable us, on the point when we encounter a voter, we interact with the voter, that we can confirm their address, we can link that address to a ward in which they want to register, and if there is a match, we register that person. And on the spot, we can also verify the citizenship of that applicant or on the population register, which is held by the Department of Home Affairs. But more critically, these devices must help us to put paid to the accusations that emerged in 2019 that persons were able to vote more times than they were entitled to by way of Section 24A. So this device will maintain a live voters roll on it, and it will update that live voters roll almost on the minute, so that if a person votes in one station and they proceed to vote, want to attempt to vote in another station, their name will already have been scratched out, and the live voters roll will indicate that the person has already participated in the elections. I'll skip these few slides. This also I can skip and speak to this slide. Key innovation for LGE 2019, for the first time, we have a platform that will enable any South African to register as a voter without interacting with a registration person at a voting station or going into a physical office of the Electoral Commission. You go to our website, you create a profile, you follow the prompts, you upload an image of your smart card or identity document, and if verified against Home Affairs, your name is placed on the voters roll. This is available for persons who have smart devices and who have data. It does not replace the other registration platforms, but it is in addition to those registration platforms. We will be going into tertiary institutions, targeting persons who have smart cards, but are not registered as voters, by sending direct messages to them, prompting them to go onto our platform and to apply for registration as a voter. The next slide deals with the COVID measures that we're putting in place at voting stations. This we have tested in no fewer than 150 by-elections since November last year, and I leave this for your reading at your leisure. Now, towards the conclusion of my input, I wish to deal with a few topical issues. The first one is that the Commission published a report in terms of Section 14.4 of the Electoral Commission Act, following a robust and transparent inquiry led by Justice Moseneke. So while people may not be happy with the outcome of the inquiry, they cannot, however, reasonably challenge it that its outcomes were predetermined, because every party that needed to participate was offered an opportunity to make written submissions and to make oral submissions. So following the release of the report, the Commission has concluded that elections if held in October 2021, will not reasonably likely to be free and fair, and that elections, if held in February 2022, will likely be free and fair. And the conclusion is based principally on two considerations. The first one is that February 2022 represents a safe period because significantly more persons would have been vaccinated than would be the case in October 2021. And the assumptions underpinning that is that medical evidence is that proves that vaccinations protect people from getting seriously ill and requiring hospitalization, and it also reduces instances of mortality. What the conclusion does not do, however, is does not discount that there might be a spike in 2022 in February. But it assumes that even if that spike were to occur, when a significant number of people have been vaccinated, that spike would not have a corresponding result of higher numbers of persons getting ill and requiring hospitalizations, and or it would not drive up the rate of death. And it is important to point out that there are a number of assumptions that underpin that, i.e. that there won't be a new variant that escapes immunity. The second reason is that elections in October 2021 may not be constitutionally compliant because of limitations placed on parties and contestants by the necessary country response to COVID-19 and the fact that the Commission has been unable to undertake a general voter registration drive. All parties in the National Party Liaison Committee are speaking in one voice to say the regulations on COVID has placed limitations on their traditional methods of canvassing voters, on their traditional methods of finalizing their list of candidates. And for that reasons, elections, if held in October, will not be free and fair. On our part, we're saying the elections, if held in October, may not meet the constitutional standard because then people who would have registered as voters have not had an opportunity to register because the Commission could not organize a registration weekend owing to the third wave of the pandemic in July. Having made these conclusions, we all know now that the Commission has, on the 4th of August, approached the Constitutional Court for relief. The relief that we seek is as follows. It's in two parts. The first one is that we're asking the court to declare that the Commission may hold elections outside the 90-day period required by the Constitution and the Municipal Structures Act, and that we are directed to hold an elections in February 2020. If the court is not minded to issue that directive, we're asking for an alternative relief, which asks the court to declare that failure to hold municipal elections by 1 November 2021 is unconstitutional and invalid, but we're asking the court to suspend the period of invalidity until February 2022 to enable the Commission to organize constitutionally compliant elections. And we're also asking for authorization for the Minister of COGTA to withdraw the notice calling the elections for 27th of October and to issue a new proclamation if the court grants the relief. The last one on this slide, and I think this is very important, we're asking the court, in order to avoid uncertainty, that the court order that the municipal councils remain competent until new ones are elected in February 2022. We already know that the Minister of COGTA has determined a date of 27 October as a date for the election. The Commission does not take any issue with the proclamation by the Minister because it understands that absent any court order authorizing her to do otherwise, she is under a legal obligation to proclaim those elections. I've already indicated the implications of proclamation, i.e. that a timetable must be issued and that the voters' roll is filled for those elections. So there is, in conclusion, a potential for confusion among voters and the general public, in that on the one hand, we're saying we have gone to court to ask for a deferral of the elections. On the other, we are seized with preparations for an election on the 27th of October. That is the case because the minister has lawfully called for those elections, and until the court gives us a relief, we are obliged to prepare for those elections. So we're managing two timetables, one for an election in October and another for an election in February next year. The one is live in that the election has been proclaimed. The other one, i.e. the February 2022 timetable, is contingent on the court granting the relief of a deferral. And we're saying that the commission may not maintain both timetables for a longer period. We need certainty and clarity sooner rather than later. Just as an update, following application to the court on the 4th of August, the court has issued directions to all interested parties and has issued a truncated timetable. In terms of that timetable, all parties that wanted to be admitted had to submit no later than, I think it was Wednesday last week, their papers, and all those parties that have submitted have been admitted by the court. There's a number of interested persons and organizations that have asked the court to admit them as friends of the court or amici curiae. Among those are the CASAC, Freedom Under Law, the Institute for Race Relations, and two other organizations whose names elude me. A number of parties have asked the court to grant them an order to intervene in the proceedings, and those are the Democratic Alliance, which is arguing that elections must proceed in October and that the commission must organize a general voter registration weekend before the end of August, or at the latest at the first week of September. The Inkatha Freedom Party has intervened to argue that they support the relief sought by the Electoral Commission. However, they differ with the Electoral Commission as it relates to the time within which an election must be held. According to the Inkatha Freedom Party, the proper time to hold elections should be 26th May 2022. The ANC has also intervened to indicate that they support the relief sought by the Electoral Commission. They, however, differ with the Electoral Commission on two issues. One, it relates to the timing for the holding of next year's election. They think that February is just too ambitious, and they have proposed a day of the first of April as a proposed voting day. Similarly, they take issue with one of our reliefs that we seek, the order that the minister be authorized to withdraw and to reissue the new date for proclamation. The economic freedom fighters have yesterday submitted the application to court to be admitted. In their papers, they wish to add that they support the relief sought by the Electoral Commission, but that if the court does not grant that relief, the economic freedom fighters insist that the commission must extend the period for candidate nomination, which is scheduled to close on the 23rd of August to a later date, to enable it to comply with submission of candidate nominations. The court has set the matter for hearing on the 20th of August, which is this Friday, or on a virtual platform. And we hope that soon thereafter, we will have a determination made by the court. As it relates specifically to journalists who cover elections, as is the tradition, journalists will be accredited to gain access into the 10 result operation centers, the one at national and one each for the provinces. In the context of COVID-19, we are investigating virtual elements in order to limit the number of people that we have at the results operation centers, however, without diluting the transparency that the ROCs provide. So if you're a journalist, we might find a way of having remote access for journalists and news agencies into the ROC without having to be physically at the result operation center. The last point is to repeat that in the Republic, we do not accredit journalists to get entry into voting stations. So if a journalist produces their press card at a voting station, that should suffice for purposes of the journalist gaining entry for reporting purposes. The code of conduct binds parties and their candidates, and it also places specific responsibilities on political parties as it relates to media workers and journalists, so that media person can be afforded the space to do their work, to cover elections and to cover campaigns in the manner that does not limit their right or does not place them in harm's way. Thank you very much, Chairperson. I took longer than I'd planned. Thank you.
Hi, colleagues. Thank you so much, Mr. Shiburi. Already there's been questions asked as you were busy addressing us. I'm going to immediately move to those questions because, yes, you've moved a little bit to overtime, and the next speaker did kindly allow me that I can give you that time. Thank you so much, Isaac. Let me ask the immediate question. One from Isaac himself says, on slide 9, why is there a difference between the number of seats and the number of elected councillors? Can you reconcile that for us, and what does that mean? Then I'll ask another question from Khomotso Ramushu. He asked for a question, but I'll take 2 at this time and then ask others a bit later. South Africa has a very low voter turnout. What impact does this have on the legitimacy of the process and also the future voter apathy trends? That's a bit confusing, but I hope you would understand it. The next question is, does the IEC have alternative income streams apart from the party registration, that's, of course, and maybe what the state gives it? Okay. Now, how do revenue streams or dependence on it affect the objectivity of the IEC, assuming, of course, that you are getting money, let's say, from some international donor, depending on the answer. But if not, this may not be necessary. So those 3 questions for now, sir.
Okay, let's invert the order of answering. The Electoral Commission has no alternative revenue streams. We receive totality of our funding from the national fiscus. That is the short answer. The party registration is not a revenue stream. Register a party, we only levy an application administrative cost of 500 rands. Again, if a party pays a deposit to contest elections and they do not get a threshold, they forfeit their deposit not to the IEC, but they forfeit that to the national fiscus or the national revenue fund. Low voter turnout and legitimacy. Indeed, a voter turnout is one of the indicators for a vibrant democracy. However, I would not fully agree with the phrasing of apathy, because we have an interesting trend in the country. The participation rate for national and provincial has always been high. In the 80s, it has come down to its 70s. It is now in the late 60s. The rate of participation, on the other hand, in municipal elections has started at a very low base of under 50%. But with the two immediate past general election, that trend has increased by a factor of about 10%. We are now in the 58% mark. We hope that that trend will hold and indeed increase, because local government elections speak to the immediacy of a voter. They speak to matters that happen on your front door, on your street, in your neighborhood, in your community. So we're hoping that those legitimacy questions will not arise, because we will be able, working with political parties, to increase the rate of participation. However, there are a number of dependencies. We can't do this by ourselves. Research indicates that there's very low levels of trust among political parties and political institutions of governance. So if you consider that you need political parties to enthuse people to register and to vote, you need people to have trust in municipal councils as political instruments. But when people do not trust those two institutions, it is understandable that their rate of participation becomes low. Isaac, the discrepancy between the number of seats and the number of councillors, there's a cogent reason for that. It eludes me just now. Can I respond by a written explanation? There is an explanation that eludes me for now.
Another question, sir, while we still have you, why do you require a fee to access the voters' roll? It might not be necessarily manageable for civic organizations. That's the first question. Is the IEC standing in society affected by the fact that some of the leaders you have may have been may have links to the ruling party? And the example is that of Mr. Mamabulo, who was a SASCO leader at some point. Does that affect the trust? Could there be a trust deficit between a society and the IEC due to that? That's the question. Hold on, the last one comes from Sinesipo. The surname Schreiber. Okay, I hope I pronounced it correctly. So practically, wants to know that Mr. Shiburi touched on the implications of the proclamation of the 27 October election date without having had the voters registration weekend done. Now, as indicated in your presentation, there's one of the lowest registration groups are younger people. Will that not be affected in this case, or would there still be a case for the registration of the younger people coming forward? There are two questions, but I've asked three. I'll ask the second one a bit later. Mr. Shiburi?
Thanks, Hopewell. I think the last point is precisely some of the reasons that we're going to court, because we have determined that an election that is not preceded by an opportunity for voters to update their details or to register stands to be challenged for constitutional compliance. We also know that there is a disproportionate impact on younger persons because they would not have had as many opportunities as some of us to register to vote, particularly those who've just attained the age of majority recently. So that is the reason why we're saying to court, we can proceed with an election on the 27th of October, but it will not meet the constitutional standard for freeness and fairness because a sizable number of participants would not have had an opportunity to register and or to update their details. Previous activity history of leader of the IEC. There's no easy way to answer this one, but given our history of oppression, it's inevitable that the majority of us would have had to participate as activists in our formative years, either in high school or in tertiary institutions, to challenge the inequalities as they obtained then. Should fighting for justice bar you from participating and contributing in shaping the content of a democratic state? I do not think so. But none of us have hold political office in any political party. None of us have ever been elected into executives of political parties. And so in terms of the regulations issued by the Electoral Commission pertaining to its staff members, those persons would have qualified. I think it would be a sad day when activists, people who know the harsh realities of inequality, are barred from contributing for no reason other than that they have a history that could in some way or form be traced to a ruling party of today. When SASCO was formed way back then, it had no relationship or alliance with the ruling party. It was just a formation of students. What happened post that is what it is, but I don't think it would be fair to exclude persons primarily from those things. But for commissioners, there is a standard. They go through a public parliamentary process before they are appointed by the president, primarily to deal with issues of suitability. For us, there is an involved recruitment process which also looks at those things to say, are we politically partisan? Are we likely to be faithful only to the Constitution and to the role that the Electoral Commission must play? The first question, I'm not sure if I heard it correctly, is it, why do we require a fee to register a political party? Okay. We want to deal with two things. One, issue of frivolity, but without putting a bar to participation. We have one of the most liberal regimes to register a political party. A person who registered a party at a national level, we only ask them to pay in a deposit of 500, advertise their logo, and submit a constitution supported by at least 500 persons. So that is to limit frivolity in the number of parties that we have on the register. As we speak, we have in excess of 600 political parties. That is after we had deregistered over 100 parties sometime late last year, because since they'd been registered, they've never contested even a by-election, they've never contested a general election, but more importantly, they've not given, as required by law, a annual notice that they still exist as political parties. As we speak, we are continuing to register political parties, and I suspect that these elections again will see some of the longest ballot papers. The longest ballot paper in a municipal election was in the city of Cape Town in 2016, where we had, I think, 36 political parties on that ballot. For 2019 elections, the biggest ballot was the national ballot with 48 political parties on that ballot. So there is a correlation between the length of a ballot paper and the ability of a voter to make a choice on an informed basis. So we must find a balance, to strike a balance, to say the democracy must be vibrant indeed, but whether people can make a choice from those number of parties. And as a parting shot, of all the 500 or odd parties that are registered, it's only around 100 if you take a combination of a number of municipalities that contest elections. Nationally, all parties that contested, all the 48 of them, only 14 parties got enough votes to garner a seat. So more does not necessarily translate into into plurality of voice or multiplicity of views, because the voters repudiate most of those parties and they return on average 13, 14 political parties to the national legislature in each of the national elections. Thank you.
But I heard, is there a fee to access the voters' roll?
Or a fee to access the voters' roll? Yes, indeed, there is a regulated fee, and that fee relates to cover our administrative cost of producing that voters' roll. We charge less than the rates that you will be charged at a commercial printing works. I think R1 a page or so, so that we defray the cost of making that voters' roll available to whoever wants it. As it relates to political parties get the first copy of a voters' roll, we give it to them for free, including the independent candidates.
Would you need more resources as the IEC to hold the elections in February or any other time that the court would agree? First question. The second question is, if some of the parties go to court and are asking for the elections to remain on the 27th of October, but they want you to host or hold another voter registration process, according to your guidelines, would this be allowed or would be unconstitutional, considering that the voters' roll has shut down now?
The last question, the parties that that are saying we must proceed with an election for October, but also want an opportunity for voter registration. That is only possible if the Constitutional Court grants an order that says they set aside, or they set aside the application, of Section 6, capital A of the Municipal Electoral Act for this election. In other words, that section provides that only a person who was registered before the date of proclamation is eligible to participate in these elections. So if that provision is not changed, it is not possible to have a registration weekend before the elections, and that those people will be on the voters' roll for those elections. However, even from a practical time perspective, we cannot accommodate a registration weekend or extend the deadline for candidate nomination without imperiling proper administration for this election. You remember I said we have 4,468 unique wards. So we're going to have a minimum of 4,468 unique elections. So we must print ballot papers for those 4,468 elections, plus 44 district PR councillor ballots, an additional 205 municipal ballots. Print them, make sure that the candidates that appear there are the correct candidate, print and distribute to our municipal sites for distribution to the 23,200 voting stations for use on election day. So if you do that, you can have a registration weekend, but will never have a properly arranged election. Do we need more resources? Indeed, we need more resources, whether or not the elections are postponed. As we speak, the PPE for elections, we do not have funds for those. We were just able to find savings and reprioritize funds in our budget to procure PPE for registration weekend. So PPE for elections are not funded. We are in discussions with National Treasury. While they are not averse to making resources available to us, we accept that there's a challenge throughout the state. If elections are extended to take place in February, indeed there will be additional costs that related to the retention of staff. There are other recommendations that the Mosenega process has brought forward, that the Commission is intent on implementing. For an example, the recommendation is that the Commission should consider an additional special voting day. You know that for the election happens on a Wednesday, and the 2 days preceding that Wednesday are special voting day. There's a strong push that we should add a third special voting day in order to decongest voting stations on voting day. To do that, we require additional funding in order to have staff recruited for those days, supplies for those days, but more importantly, overnight storage of those ballots, because we only count the ballots on the date, on the voting day. So we don't count at the end of each day. So there will be a need for additional resources if the elections are postponed, but there is already existing need for PPE, even for the elections on the 27th of October.
Yeah, colleagues, we will go fairly quickly through the material. I just want to ask Lemise to, as we agreed, to just quickly put on the screen where you will find the material that we'll be dealing with. So if you go to that election portal and at the top you click on training, and then you get to module 1 where we are now. And you will see there a little lower down, you'll see a full text, a chapter that was written that will cover most of the material that I'll be dealing with. And just above that, you will also see the presentation that Mr. Shiburi made, IEC preparations for the local government elections, as well as the slides that I'll be using now, and the timeline for the elections, which is really full of stories. Right, so let me see if I can share my screen now. While I'm doing that, I would like to know how many elections will we have, whether on 27 October or 23 February. Anybody who know the answer to that, please post it in the chat, and let's see who comes up with that answer. Right, I think you can all see my presentation now. And let me just explain where this fits in. So as journalists, what we are trying to do is to tell a balanced story about the elections. And I always refer to the 4 Ps of election coverage. That's, as Sabu said right at the start, first thing, it's actually about the citizens, the people. So the people is the first P. How does elections impact on people and the people's right to elect a government that they want? The second one is about places. So profiling places, what is the impact of the current authorities, whether it's national, provincial, or local government, on the place where the citizens live, on service delivery, on quality of life, etc. The third one, and I'm particularly putting it the third one, is the parties, because we really need to get our focus on the people and the places, and yes, then the parties contesting the elections. Very often election coverage, I think, focus so much on parties that it's not focusing enough on the citizens and where they live. And the fourth P is process. So it's people, places, parties, process. And this is really what we're dealing today, the electoral process. And what we're trying to present today is just to give you context and background on how to do stories, but also to point out stories. I think Mr. Shiburi's presentation, actually, I was making a list here. I got at least 20 possible stories just from his presentation. And if one understands the electoral cycle, that is another way of identifying lots of stories. The point of this is to say that the electoral cycle is a continuous process. And in fact, in South Africa, we deal with two of these wheels, the local election electoral cycle and the national and provincial electoral cycle. So this gives you an idea of the kind of preparations that's necessary in the pre-electoral period, electoral period, and post-electoral period. So lots of work done in the 3-4 years before the countdown to each election, planning, training, information, registration. And then when you get into the electoral period, as we are now, where you start to deal with campaign, nominations, and later on voting and the results, and then getting in the post-electoral on reflection of the previous election, possible reforms, and looking at strategies for further elections. So as an example, the Electoral Amendments Act that Mr. Shiburi referred to was a result of 3-4 years of preparing and looking at how the South African electoral system should be updated. So you can always come back to this electoral cycle also in the smaller print that's maybe difficult to read on the screen. These are lots of possible story ideas for elections. I'm going to skip some slides just because I need to be fast. I just want to say about this. I mean, always go back to, if you can see me on the screen, the Constitution and the electoral legislation. You can usually get this electoral legislation booklet from the IEC. Please remember that it gets updated regularly. The one that I have here is a 2019 version, so it doesn't include the latest electoral amendment bill, but it puts together all the changes to to all the different election electoral acts, which you see on the screen now. It puts all of that together and do all the updates. So it's not like going to an amendment act and you just see bits and pieces. And of course, this should be the little booklet that you keep with you all the time to understand the elections, to know how to report accurately, to quote accurately what parties may do, what the IEC should do, etc. And there's a really good summary of that also in the full text that I showed you a little earlier. I will come back to a few of the issues on this slide as we continue. One thing that I would like to highlight is the Electoral Code of Conduct that Mr. Shiburi also referred to. This is really important in the arsenal of a journalist, especially if you do on-the-ground reporting on parties, because parties need to oblige to this code of conduct and could be or should be reported by citizens, which include journalists, when they do not comply with this electoral code of conduct. So it's anything from using language which provokes violence, intimidation of candidates and voters, and all the other issues that you see there. But what's very important is that there's actually a clause, the media clause, in the Electoral Code of Conduct, which I think we should have a really good look at. It says, every registered party and every candidate must respect the role of the media before, during, and after an election conducted in terms of this act. They may not prevent access by members of the media to public political meetings, marches, demonstrations, and rallies. And they must take all reasonable steps to ensure that journalists are not subjected to harassment. And that is, of course, also online harassment, right? Intimidation, hazard, threat, or physical assault by any of the representatives or supporters. Now, in previous elections, there's been a problem with the application of the Code of Conduct. because the parties and the candidates only signed adherence to this code of conduct once the IEC had processed their request to participate in the elections and finalized the candidate lists submitted by the parties, meaning 4 to 6 weeks before the elections. So effectively, in the past, this code of conduct was only in effect for the last 4 to 6 weeks. And even then, journalists and newsrooms, editors often had problems when they then went to the IEC to complain about parties transgressing this media clause. Sometimes the answer was, well, just go to the police. But in fact, you'll see on the next slide when I get there, we have all the right to take this issue to the IEC and to the Electoral Court. Now, Mr. Shaburi, in the slide that he had about amendments to the Electoral Acts, there was one line there to say, to bring clarity to the starting date or implementation date of the Electoral Code of Conduct. So from this election onwards, this code is effective from the day of promulgation of the elections, which was 3 August, right? So this is effective now. If parties transgress this now, we have a route to, we can use this and we can take them to the IEC, to the Electoral Court, to the police, for them to comply with this clause. So I'll touch a little bit on this later on. Let's just look then at the composition of the IEC, comprised of 5 commissioners, of which one must be a judge, which is Judge Pillay. All part of a Chapter 9 institution, meaning they on an arm's length from government. They required in terms of the constitution to be impartial without fear, favor, or prejudice. They must manage the elections or any other electoral processes such as referenda, and they must ensure that the elections are free and fair. So those 5 commissioners then are in charge of the IEC as a body, give them direction. So they're like the directors of a company, of which Mr. Sai Mamabolo is the chief electoral officer. So please be careful in your reporting. Often people say the IEC CEO. It's not the IEC chief executive officer. It's the country's chief electoral officer. And then you'll see the 4, what was initially 4 deputies, which is now 5 deputies, of which Mr. Shaburi, the one on the right, Deputy CEO Electoral Operations, addressed us and 3 others for outreach, corporate service, and finance. But then there's a new one on the left, the Chief Executive Political Party Funding, which is Mr. George Mahlangu, which came into place as part of the party funding legislation that went through Parliament last year and was implemented earlier this year. In fact, the very first parties are obliged to report on the monies that they receive, and the donors are also obliged to report on that. So there are 3 ways now that parties can get money. One is direct donations to parties that they need to disclose. 2 is donations to a democracy fund, where the IEC distributes the money, also by private or non-government funders. And thirdly, it is the normal government allocations to to political parties. And the IEC manage all three of those processes. So for the first quarter since the Act has been implemented, from 1 April to end of June, the parties had to finish their submissions on how much money they received in those 3 months during July, and the IEC is currently reviewing all that data, and we expect that they will later in August, for the very first time, then share with the public a summary of those donations. So that's a big story coming up that you should diarize. Provincial electoral offices, I'm not sure if there is already a new one in Mpumalanga, whether that vacancy has been filled. If anybody know if it is, please put it in the chat. The other vacancy that you'll see on some of our earlier material, Western Cape, Mr. Michael Hendrickse, which is updated on this slide. So he's recently been appointed to replace Courtney Sampson in the Western Cape, and all the others are still in place. So they have the same rights and responsibilities of the national CEO over the national elections and national affairs of the IEC. So provincially, they run the elections for province and district municipalities and municipalities. An important part of the South African electoral system is party liaison committees, which is not present in many other jurisdictions, right? This is when the electoral legislation was finalized and the constitution was finalized in '96. This was fairly new in the world to incorporate a party liaison committee. Essentially, it is a structure that exists on a national level, on a provincial level, and on a municipal level. It's structures that exist to consult parties on electoral processes and procedures and legislation. So as an example, before any legislation would even go the normal route to Parliament, parties would have had an opportunity to make input into that. Typically, the party liaison committees on all the levels will sit regularly, a number of times a year, and in the year before the elections, they would typically sit around monthly, and in the 3 months before the elections, they would, I think, sit twice a month or so. I'm not 100% sure about that schedule. And you may have seen, those of you who've been at electoral centers during election week, there's normally a conference room or an area set aside, and the liaison committees will meet a number of times a day often. For instance, if there are complaints, the first thing that the IEC will do is to go and share the complaints with the party liaison committee and also get their advice. So this is really a system which helps the IEC to manage the elections in a consultative way without abdicating their right to manage the election. But the parties are always included in the communication cycle used during the election time. The Electoral Court, another important part of our system. They can hear appeals or reviews decisions made by the IEC, determine any matter related to the interpretation of any law, referred to it by the IEC. So this is important in terms of the code of conduct, right? So if there's a complaint in terms of the code of conduct, you go to the IEC first, and the IEC can refer it to the Electoral Court. There is a way that you can go directly to the Electoral Court, but better to first go through the IEC. And they can investigate allegations of misconduct, incapacity, incompetence of a member of the IEC and make a recommendation to the National Assembly. So if somebody needs to be removed from the IEC commission Also, it must be done through the Electoral Court first before it goes to Parliament. Here's a list of electoral offences as you find it in the legislation. It's an electoral offence to register, to force anyone to register or not to register, to vote or not to vote, to support or not support a political party, to vote or not vote for a political party or candidate, to attend or not political event, essentially protecting the rights of citizens to decide if and how they want to exercise their electoral rights. Let's look briefly at the difference between the different types of elections. Both of them must be held in cycles of 5 years. But we have very different systems. So effectively, the Constitutional Court finding last year about the unconstitutionality of the Electoral Act because independents cannot participate in national and provincial elections. That problem is not present in the municipal system, but because the municipal systems already have that provision that it is a mix of proportional representation and a ward candidate electoral system. Although the overall condition for elections to be free and fair is that parties must be proportionally represented, even though you have this mixed system, and I'll explain this in a moment a little bit better. So let's look at the voting system, right? So essentially, if you're in a local municipality, not a metro, then you have 3 votes. You vote for your preferred party, you vote for your preferred ward candidate in the ward where you live, and you vote for a district council, also for the party in the district council. So let's just explain that quickly. So all local municipalities which are not metros, and if you recall, we have 205 of that in the country, right? So all of them fall into a district which is governed by a district council. So the first 2 votes, so one will go to the party in the council, the other one to the ward candidate. Now to calculate who won in a particular municipality is much more complicated than many people think, because of the principle I referred to earlier, that overall parties should govern on a proportional basis. So this is a process. Number one, the IEC will look at all the votes received by a party, whether it was in a PR vote or for a party-affiliated ward candidate. So it will look at, so excluding the votes for the independents at this stage. So it would look at that and make a calculation to say, so how many seats should this party get in total? The second step is then to count how many seats a particular party has won in the ward election. So say, for instance, there's 100 seats in a council, and this particular party, in terms of the initial calculation, should proportionally get 60 of the 100 seats. So then they would count, so how many wards of the 50 wards has this party won? Now, say for instance, this party has won 35 ward seats. Then in the proportional seats is then the result of the some 60 seats that they should get. They already have 35. Therefore, the top 25 people on their proportional list will then be allocated PR seats. Now, that process explains the phenomenon in councils where parties that come second and third and fourth often have relatively more PR seats because they didn't want enough wards, so they get more PR seats. Where you also then, this often then results in the kingmaker situation that the small party who never won any single ward, but they got enough votes to actually earn 1 or 2 PR seats, and if the first and the second party are very close, as we see in, for instance, many Western Cape councils, then that party can often back either of the two to form a council. On district municipalities, it works a little bit different. 40% of the of the council seats get elected directly through the PR vote. And when the council, say for instance, there's 5 councils in the district, the rest of the 60% of the district council seats get divided amongst them, depending on how big the councils are. And then after the elections, at the first council meeting, they decide which of their councillors will also sit on the district council. And by the way, I think this is the explanation for the question I put to Mr. Shaburi. Why is there a difference between the number of seats and the number of councillors? It is because some local councillors also sit on district councils. So that's the system for those municipalities. In metros, there are no district councils. It's a straight 50-50. You just have 2 ballots to vote, 1 PR and 1 for wards, and the calculations are the same. I notice that I will go not a little bit over, but not more than 5 minutes, Hopewell and colleagues. So just stay with me for 5 more minutes. So you have the key milestones in the election period. I'll ask Lemise if she can please post the link to the election timetable that is on that list of links that I showed you right at the start. So these are just 10 of the steps. There are many more, but really when you do editorial planning to cover the elections, this is your guide, because it tells you, it gives you the details about the voters' roll. It gives you the details about the voting stations. It tells you when parties need to register for the election, when the IC announced which parties are eligible. It talks about when you can get access to the list of candidates. So this is really a quick reference to what stories to be done when. Now, I just want one caution here. Often when we report on parties, we talk about parties registering for an election. That's not true in the South African system. As Mr. Shaburi said, there are currently about 600 parties registered on the IEC system to participate in all or some of national, provincial, and local government elections. So they're all registered parties. So in the South African system, you don't register to participate in the elections because you're already registered. All you need to do is to pay the deposit and submit candidate lists, and that indicates that you want to participate in the election. So it's wrong to say X number of parties are registered to participate in the elections. You say so many parties will participate in the election. On voting and counting, I think I will not go into this. It will take a little bit too long. except for, I just want to deal with the issue of objections in the counting process. So just want to focus on the one issue about how election results can be challenged. Now, in the South African system, if you want to challenge election results, you need to challenge the results of a particular voting station. So in a ward, you have a number of voting districts, and it can be literally anything from one in rural areas to 10 or more in metro areas. So you have a number of voting districts. There's usually one voting station in each voting district where you vote. So if you want to challenge the results, you need to demonstrate why you think the counting in that voting station is not correct. So if a party says to you, we're going to challenge the results for KwaZulu-Natal, then the question to the party should be, okay, now please give us a list of all the voting stations in KwaZulu-Natal and tell us why you're challenging each of them. Because the process is actually quite structured. The first opportunity to parties to challenge a result is during the counting progress, because party agents participate and monitor the counting. Not they do the counting themselves, but they watch over the electoral officials doing that. So literally they can say that vote that you just put in there, take it out and show me that you put it on the right bundle for the right party. They can ask for recounts and solve most of those problems there. Once there's an obligation on the IEC electoral officer in the in that voting stations to make sure to get maximum consensus on the final result by dealing with challenges and dealing with recounts. But at some stage, the officer will need to be comfortable that that he or she is happy with the results. What then happens is it gets it's made available usually on a piece of paper on a door or somewhere or notice board, and it is transmitted to the IEC municipal office. Then later on they take the real votes also to the municipal office, and only if those two sets of information if that correlates, then only it's put into the municipal results system, and that's regarded as a final result, except if it's challenged and set aside. So we're not dealing with provisional results ever. We always deal with final results unless it's set aside. And then there's also, if there's a batch of voting district results, it may be a problem. It will go through the party liaison committee, it will be audited, and so on. So I just wanted to explain that, and we should be careful on how we report on parties' claim that they're going to challenge a whole municipal results, because they cannot. They must challenge it on voting station by voting station level. So I'm wrapping up. Yes, two useful booklets that you will find both on the electoral portal. On the left-hand side is the African Commission on Human People's Rights Guidelines on Access to Information in Elections in Africa. What this is effectively a checklist of information that electoral stakeholders, which include the IEC, the security forces, the parties, the observers, etc., that they must disclose proactively. So you can use it as a checklist. If a party does not want to tell you something about their internal processes to elect to nominate their candidates, you can go to them and say, well, don't you comply with these guidelines? And then the one on the right-hand side is an assessment based on these guidelines done after the last elections. with a whole set of specific recommendations for the municipal elections. So you can go into that, look at the recommendations, and there's lots and lots of stories about that. And then there's just further reading, and I'm done. I'm happy to end here, and I leave it to Amina and Hopewell to decide if we want to deal with questions, or I can, when I can see questions again, I can also try to answer them in the chat. Thank you.
We are going to go straight into the next session, Isak, if that is okay with everyone. We have an expert panel of 3 different editors, but I will start by introducing our colleague, Ms. Angie Capelianos, also from SANEF. She's at the SABC. She's news input head, and she has a wealth of experience of having covered several elections in South Africa. So if I may, Angie Capelianos, over to you. She'll talk us through broadcasting and her experience and expertise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amina. I hope nobody minds. Can I go off video? Or do you want me on video? I'm a radio journalist editor, so I really don't mind, but I don't want you to get distracted by what you see to what I have to speak to. So
we want you to stay on video, my lady.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Apologies from our SABC News head and editor-in-chief, Patiswa Magupeni, who was invited to do this presentation. She had another appointment that she couldn't cancel and asked me to step in. And I want to say first to SANEF, of which I'm a council member, thank you so much for hosting and preparing for these election webinars virtually. I think they're vitally important. And given that we have an official election date of the 27th of October, but a constitutional court case coming up, different options by the political parties, proposals, it's timely that we start with these election briefings right now to get our heads around a lot of things. And we're generally very busy with a lot of breaking news. I also want to say a huge thank you to Mr. Shiburi from the IEC. The way in which he explained the IEC and the key issues, the topical issues, and also to Isak. There are a lot of complicated, stodgy things that happen. And we as journalists and reporters need to be able to summarize and crystallize them in order to communicate them effectively. And Isak, I agree with you, there are tons of story ideas hidden everywhere, whether it was Mr. Shiburi's presentation or even in the timelines that you said. And sometimes it's not just in the timelines, it's what's behind the timelines or what's behind the news release. But let me cut to the chase and focus on the brief, a reporter's quick guide to covering local elections. And I think this will also illustrate what Mr. Shiburi said and did, and Isak too. Number 1, know your stuff. Know it inside and out. What are elections all about? What's the point and purpose of elections? What's the difference between national and provincial elections versus local government or municipal elections? Who's involved? Who do you need to tap into, to talk to, and to reflect? What's different about these elections compared to the last one, the previous ones, all the others? So we've had local government elections since 1995, and the elections were split over 2 years. The IEC might not officially count those, but the first local government elections I did was in 1995 and in 1996, and it also related to KwaZulu-Natal. So go back in history, know what the key elements of each election were. What was the climate? What were the important points? Key to these elections, like all elections, what are the issues? What's at stake? My list of questions could and does go on, and that's the point. Question absolutely everything and everyone to find the answers, to find the facts, to better understand, to really understand what's going on. And most importantly, why is something happening? How is it happening? How is it manifesting? And what does all of that mean? Like Isak has done his homework, like Mr. Shiburi did his homework, do your homework, prep. Read everything that you need to read. From the seemingly most boring and dry laws and regulations, they are important. Read with meaning, read with understanding, and develop the ability, as I said earlier, to be able to summarize, to crystallize the essence of what you're reading and what's important. And in doing your homework, your prep, your reading, this is, I think, Isaac's third P. Know the area, the places, know the area that you're covering. The district municipalities, and if you live in a province or a city that has a metro. The wards, know all the issues that are at stake. What's working, what's not working, why it's not working, what's being done about it, what's the background, what's the context, how did this happen? How has it been allowed to go on for so long? How can it be fixed? How can it be prevented and avoided? And in doing your research, don't dismiss literature. And here I'm talking about novels and poetry, no matter what the language, whether it's English or Sotho or Zulu or Tswana. This may seem completely inappropriate for a reporter's guide, quick guide to covering local elections, but it can add to your knowledge and your understanding of a place and a people, as well as to the texture and flavor of your reporting and journalism. And I want to illustrate this point. I'm reminded of a little story and an invaluable tip from the 2005 Pulitzer Prize winner for international reporting, Dele Olojede from Nigeria. And he shared this tip with us at one of Paula Frey's Neiman Narrative Journalism conferences with us in Joburg. And that was many, many years ago, and I still remember that to this day. So give or take, it was 95, latest 96, you can do the maths. Olojede won the Pulitzer for his series on the 10th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. Among all the books that he read in preparing to cover that story, he took one thin novel with him to Rwanda, and it had absolutely nothing to do with Rwanda, his research or his investigation. The thin novel was the classic, The Old Man and the Sea, for which the American author Ernest Hemingway himself had won a Pulitzer Prize over half a century earlier. And the point of this little story is that Olojede believed that Hemingway's writing, his writing style, his choice of crisp words, short sentences, all of that and more, helped him and shaped his writing to tell the Rwandan series, the Rwandan genocide 10 years later. So don't dismiss the novels and poetry in improving your writing style. It may also just help you win an award, but that's a by the way. Right at the beginning of this election webinar, SANEF chairpersons Boone Galwa referred briefly to the stories hidden in the numbers. And this is my next point. Look at the numbers, look for the numbers. Go to Stats SA, WASI Map, the Auditor General's municipal reports, the IEC website, just to name a few. What are the most important numbers? What do they say? What do they mean? Where's the story or the stories in those numbers? How do you tell that story without getting bogged down by numbers? Long numbers with lots of zeros, millions and billions, or numbers and percentages with commas. Round it off unless that comma is the difference between losing and winning. Ward 7, for example, means absolutely nothing to me. I don't know where Ward 7 is. I don't know that the person in Lusikisiki, the person in Pofada, the person in J Bay, that anybody knows where Ward 7 is. So we've got to drill it down to that which people can get and understand very quickly. I understand, I for example, don't know, haven't checked, can't remember what my ward number is. And yes, that information hidden in that ward is important, but I know where I live. I know the suburb in which I live. I know the surrounding suburbs. I know the city in which I live, or the town, or the dorpie, or the village. Help people to understand working in your specific medium. Here I'm also going to be broadcast specific. The generally fleeting mediums of radio, and to a lesser extent TV, which can use graphics, generally don't like numbers. They don't like numbers on the tongue, and they don't like numbers on the ear. Radio and TV generally are not number-friendly mediums. Let me be radio specific. A radio reporter or journalist really has one chance to get it right, to be clearly understood. A listener generally can't pause or rewind live radio, for example, while they're driving. And the last thing you want them to do is to say, what was that? Did I hear right? Did I get it right? Did they make a mistake? So make it easy for your audience to understand the information that you're working with. And I also don't mean dumb it down. People are not stupid. They can be uneducated and intelligent. They're not stupid. So don't dumb it down. Just make it easy, accessible, easy to understand. Work towards the strengths of your medium, be it radio, TV, print, photography, online, social media. And I know that, I think there was an idea that I just talked to broadcasting. The SABC is no longer just doing broadcasting. We have radio, TV, the traditional mediums, but we've also gone online. We've got our SABC News website, the apps. We're on social media. So we're also having to think about writing and what gets published, whether it's on a tweet or it lives for a longer time on the website. In doing your homework and prepping, getting ready, I want to also talk about just two other not so obvious skills that a reporter, journalist, editors need to hone. And these two can separate reporters and journalists from the rest. The one relates to observation skills. It's not just in the reading. What do you see every day? What do you see when you get to the traffic lights, the robots? When you turn into Hillbrow and you see the Rea Vaya bus station that has been, well, I don't know if it's a bus station, this concrete thing in the middle of the road that has been sitting there for years and years and years, an incomplete project. Where did that money go? Why is it not finished? We're talking about extending the Gautrain, for example, in Johannesburg, but Rea Vaya just ended in the middle of nowhere at Hillbrow. How are these public transport systems going to connect? Are there a competency of local government? If not, maybe it's a story for another day. But use your observation skills. What do you see? What's not right? What's incomplete? What stands out? What's defining? And then if you had to describe that to someone, how would you do it? In as few words as possible, but at the same time without being cryptic, adding to greater confusion. How would you paint the picture? Would you describe and paint everything and leave nothing to your audience's imagination? Or would you describe that which is salient, defining, different, and that which stands out? Because that's going to make your journalism, even on local elections, stand out. The second not so obvious skill that I think we as journalists and editors need to sharpen are our listening skills. For me, they're key as a journalist. How you listen, how closely you listen, how carefully you listen. What is the person saying? Go beyond that. What are they really saying? What do they mean? And then even more importantly, what are they not saying? What are they leaving out? Why are they leaving that out? What are they hinting at? From that, you can find your story. You can find your characters, you can find your quotable quotes, your up sounds, your sound bites. That then begins to illustrate your story and to enhance your story, including on local government and local elections. Okay, so at this point, you're probably asking, what is she going on about? A lot of what she said has nothing to do with the reporter's quick guide to covering local elections. And you're absolutely right. If you want to be boring, if you want to be bland, and if you want to blend into the crowd. But if you want to stand out, and if you want to have your stories, in this case, your local government, your local election stories, stand out, be noticed and remembered many years down the line, okay? It's about how you approach your stories, the people that you interview, how you allow them to express themselves in their own way and in their own words. I don't want to know about your opinion. I want to know about their opinion. I want to know about how they feel, their joys, their frustrations, their challenges. So this, I think, begins to help us to tell our stories differently. And it's not specific to local government or local government elections. Somebody used the word earlier about the fundamentals. It's always about going back to basics. I think now is a good time. The other just quick points that I want to talk about before I end. I would ask all our reporters and journalists and editors, what do you want to know? You must be curious. You must have question marks, but at the same time, you want to get the answers. And more than that, something we don't really talk about is, do you care? Do you really care what your city looks like? Do you care what the dorpie looks like? Do you care who's getting services and who's not? People are paying for those services. Yes, not everyone's paying, and there's this pool of money, but where is that money going? Why are our municipalities in disrepair, dysfunctional? They have no money. What happened? How is that right? How can that continue? And maybe going beyond, a little bit beyond the care, and I'm cautious to use this word, do you rage? How much do you rage? And I'm worried about using that word. You must rage inside, and it must come out in your storytelling. But it's not, it's the difference between, I suppose, being an advocate, an activist, and a politician, and a journalist. Somewhere find the fine line. But deep down, there must be this flame in you that says this is not right, something is wrong. Not in our name. So to end off, you need to understand what district councils are, municipal councils, metros, what the municipalities are responsible for. They're responsible for bylaws, rates and taxes, roads, refuse collection, sanitation, electricity, stormwater management, town planning, the development of villages, dorpies, and cities. And in between all of that lie the people's stories. The people who are residents. They are, not all of them citizens, the majority are. Not all of them are eligible voters. But how are they affected? What is their experience? How are you conveying that? And even in the difficult stories to tell, the story about numbers, the story about municipal finances, which will come up in another SANEF webinar later. All of that is important. But it's how you approach your story. It's how you approach people. But you've got to get ready for that. And that starts often quietly behind the scenes. And then one thing we generally don't talk about, it's about the creation of memories. And maybe this is just very close to my heart because I've lived and worked in radio for 30 plus years, a little bit of TV, but mainly radio. It's about the creation of memory. And there's no formula for that. But often quietly, I would say to myself, well, I do the journalism, I collect the facts, I do the research, I look for the sound bites. I ask myself quietly, how will I remember that person? What stands out about them? How would I describe their face? Whether it was Omatuku Simpela in 1995, and she had creases in her desert sand colored face, for example. What do I remember? What about this event do I remember? How do I capture the essence of that to convey? Because I think it's got to go beyond down the line reporting. And maybe I've just paid more attention to that in my reporting because I've worked in such a fleeting medium called radio. But you can do it in any medium that you work on. When you send out a tweet, is it just another tweet adding to the noise and the traffic? Or is somebody going to say, and go back to it and want to share it? And why are they sharing it? And I'm using probably an even more fleeting medium like social media where there is so much going on. So it is about the creation of memories. How do you create a memory? How do your stories live beyond the now where I can't even remember what happened yesterday? I think that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Adrian. For a moment, I thought you were not there. Editor-in-Chief of News 24, Adrian, welcome. If you've missed the intense input we had earlier on from our panelists and Isaac and Mr. Shiburi, please let us have your ideas and expertise. Thanks very much.
It's nice to be here, and I must say the input by Angie and Nwabisa has been so excellent. I have very little left to say, specifically because I do agree with both of them that the vitals, or as Nwabisa called it, the main thing is the same, irrespective of platform. I don't think, you know, if you go out to cover the election for News 24 or for the Sowetan or for SABC Radio, that you have a complete different approach. You look for the story, and we tell stories. We are storytellers, and we look for the truth out there and for compelling stories backed up by facts and data. So I will maybe just limit my input to digital specifically, to a few issues that I think are particularly important for digital platforms heading into an election. And this could be any election, but as Isaac factually and diligently showed earlier, there is an incredible amount of data available on the local government election, because we are not only electing we are not electing premiers or a president as in the national and provincial government election, but mayors and councils for every single of, I think, the almost 300 municipalities in South Africa. And that is an immense amount of data, which also makes it very tangible for every journalist, irrespective of whether you work on a national title like News 24, or if you work for a small local radio station or newspaper. This election is relevant for you, and you can find the data about your municipality. And I think what's been important for me through the years covering elections at News 24 has been to always have a very healthy mix of data coverage and of human interest stories and of service delivery stories. It's not an issue of either or. You should never choose only to do data stories or only to do people stories. Ultimately, the two things are not in opposition to each other. They require different skills from different journalists and different experts in your team or outside your team who can help. But ultimately, we should do both those things. In terms of data storytelling, I think journalists, a lot of journalists have not fully grasped the extent of the data to which you have access through the IEC. Obviously, this year SANEF has also built its own tools, and I'm very proud of those tools that you can all start playing with to track your mayors and look at their election results and participation in your municipalities. But if you just go to the IEC's website, I mean, the amount of data, the fact that you can track the election results for all the elections that's happened since 1994, that you can track them, the fact that that's real-time reporting of data on election day is really very empowering for a website. And I would encourage all of you with websites to invest in skills, in training on how to read the data, how to work a spreadsheet. And I'm not talking computer science stuff here. I'm talking very basic Microsoft Office, Excel tutorial on how to use a spreadsheet, how to import data of previous elections, how to build basic graphs, how to use free tools on the internet to build basic graphs and maps that you can embed into your website. You don't need millions of rands or very expensive developers to do these things anymore. They are freely available, they are accessible, and even someone like myself with a BA degree can use these tools and understand them to a large extent. So I think, you know, the power of data is probably what gives online platforms the edge when it comes to elections coverage. And again, here it can feel very overwhelming. And I know the term data is being thrown around very liberally sometimes, but don't feel overwhelmed by the concept. Just start playing around. Start playing around on the IC website. Go look into your own municipality where you live or where your parents live or where you grew up, and try and make sense of historical data. Historical data, I find, is a very powerful tool to tell election stories because it tells you the stories of trends. it shows you participation between voter turnout over the past almost 30 years. It shows you the fluctuation in support. So if you, for example, I'm just going to pick a town here, if you work on a local newspaper in Newcastle, in KwaZulu-Natal, go and download the election results for that municipality since the first municipal election. Save those results on an Excel spreadsheet, and the moment the new results come in, you can start to not only build graphics but get information for stories. You will see yourself, you will have the data to say the IFP support has gone up or down, the ANC has grown, the ANC has gone down, whatever the results may show. I think journalists often wait for political parties and political analysts to analyze the election results. You don't have to do that. You can sit with the results because you have access to all the previous year's results, and you can tell compelling stories. I will never forget in the I think it was the one of the last two local government elections. Well, let's take the last one. I mean, there were sea change results in the last provincial local government election in 2016, when we suddenly had opposition parties getting enough votes to form coalition governments in Tshwane, Johannesburg, Nelson Mandela Bay. And I mean, just to have access to that election data, you could quickly yourself tell those stories in real time as the data comes in. You can drill down to voting districts, to voting halls, to stations, pick a school, pick a library, decide that you're going to track the support at that school for the past 25 years. And build this beautiful story about that. And then I would argue, secondly, also go to that school. Go tell the human stories as well, because the data will show you that party A is losing support, but the data will not tell you why. And to answer the why questions, we still need journalists, boots on the ground. We still need to go into those towns, into the rural areas, into the townships, into the cities, into the suburbs, and go speak to real people. Go ask them about why they think party A has been losing support, or why party C from nowhere has made massive inroads. I think a combination of data and human reporting is crucial to success in the online platform. And lastly, I will just quickly speak a bit about fact-checking. It's again become a bit of a catchphrase, but I really think it's not only the right thing to do, it is critical for us journalists to do fact-checking during an election and use our digital platform specifically to challenge misinformation that is definitely going to be spread, specifically by political parties in this time. So be very careful of social media. Be very careful of who you follow on social media, what you repeat, what you see, and what you retweet on Twitter, for example. I think we have very powerful ways and tools to set the record straight, to fact check in real time, and that we should absolutely be doing that even to a much more aggressive way than we did previously. So the way I view social media, and certainly the way I encourage my journalists in our newsroom to view social media, is to see it merely as a uncorroborated tip-off. Not unlike a call to the newsroom in the days when we still went to the newsroom, from an anonymous source telling you something. That is the way, I think, to approach social media, not to repeat it without critical interrogation, but to see it as merely tip-offs that should still be followed up by rigorous fact-checking, meaning pick up the phone, speak to someone, go there, check for yourself, or look at the data if it's a story that needs data. I think it's going to be absolutely critical that we that we are very sensitive about how social media will be abused and used in the coming election. We saw during the recent unrest in specifically KwaZulu-Natal, how social media was abused by powerful people with deep networks to pour fuel on the flames, on the fire. And we're going to have to be very careful not to be dragged into that during the election. Remember what happened with not only Bal Pottinger and the Gupta leaks in South Africa, and how social media was used to change narratives, but also how Donald Trump in the United States, through very sophisticated measures and companies, used social media narratives, Facebook specifically, to try and sway public opinion. Let's be very vigilant and awake to these things, and use our platforms, which I still believe are more powerful and has much more credibility than social media together, to spread the truth. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Amina.
Our next panelist is our Ms. Nwabisa Makunga, excuse me. She is the editor of the Sowetan. She is also on the executive committee of the management and executive committee of SANEF. Welcome, Nwabisa. Great to see you.
Sure. Thank you very much. Amina, colleagues, hi. I hope you can hear me. Angie, I thought that was absolutely excellent. Thank you very much. I actually, while listening to you, I was like, this is why I loved, for pretty much most of my life, covering local government, not just the elections, but essentially the story of local government. So thank you very much for reminding us again of not only why it's an exciting thing to cover, but why it's so important, for our careers, but also for. So my brief was really to talk about, print and I suppose storytelling as far as print is concerned. And I mean, I want to move away from the brief if the colleagues will allow me, because I don't necessarily believe in a platform-specific approach, when it comes to covering news and in telling our stories. While platforms are obviously important are the spaces on which we share our journalism. But I think, with the evolution of particularly of digital and the media, we realize that, for example, a platform like print is no longer one that is, the of storytelling. So I'd like to really talk about, and echoing a lot of what Angie has said, to talk about just some principles and some experiences as far as covering local government. So I come, Smungalwa and I, the chairperson of SANEF, and I come from the Eastern Cape. And one of the things that Smu often tells a story, and says, in South Africa, there is such a perception that the Eastern Cape, for example, is one of the most, is probably the most corrupt province in the country. And that perception is really created not so much because, it is so. I mean, there's definitely, major corruption down there. But I think it's because of the reportage, of it, and particularly reportage at a very, very local level, at a very granular level. And I think, unlike perhaps many parts of the country, that kind of, going deep into those details, it is not something that happens quite often. And for me, it's something that I think we should really begin a conversation about. How do we tell stories, at a local level in a way that not only resonate, but really kind of put a mirror, to our audience and saying, this is what our cities and our towns look like. If you just take a snapshot of our country, and we come into this election at a time where our country is pretty much dilapidated. It's really, really in ruins. I was having a conversation with a colleague this morning saying, oh, again, I woke up without water. And it's become one of those things that are kind of the norm. And the danger perhaps in recognizing that is in saying that, well, this is what it is today, is normalizing, the state of crisis that we're in. And I think as journalists, our role becomes far more important trying to tell our story and asking the questions that Angie's saying we must ask about why this is so and who's going to do what about it. So I think Isak mentioned earlier, and I was quite excited when you mentioned your 4 Ps, because the first part of the point that I want to drive home is really what I thought was your first P. And for me, it's that local government and the elections are about people. We often fall into this trap of being very much centered around, political parties and why they are important. And yes, we should follow, what they're doing for purposes of accountability. But I think we should never actually move away, in as far as centering people and ordinary citizens, and some of them who are not citizens and residents, as the center of the story. So for me, this bottom-up approach is probably a far more effective one than a top-down approach. And I think to do that, we need to be able to, be ourselves going into these communities. It's quite hard sometimes because obviously, any editor will tell you about the resources on the ground and how we are able to, how we are trying to do, far more with less, and how we're trying to stretch ourselves as much as possible. But I do think because that is so important that we do that, I think that the issue of planning becomes quite an important one. In every newsroom is probably the one thing that we need to be priding ourselves, in doing. I think the idea of telling, people's stories, as Andrew, you put it quite nicely, it's really about, where do you live? What happens there? Why is the situation, the way that it is? For us to be able to ask those questions and really translate the experiences of people onto the platforms, on which we publish, and to be able to then ask, and moving forward to say, to ask questions of accountability. So why, if you look at many cities, there are squabbles everywhere as far as, leadership is concerned, and et cetera. And I think a lot of us as journalists will kind of get caught up in perhaps the excitement, I don't know if it is the excitement of telling the leadership squabble, but what is really the impact, of that? What is the impact of that, on not just revenue collection? What is the impact of that on our street, the condition of our roads, just our infrastructure, and who then, gets to do what about it? There's a trend, I think, that I've seen in South Africa where people are beginning to do things for themselves, and the private sector, I think, has come on board. The challenge for me, while that is I suppose it's a good thing as far as, active citizen. The challenge with that is that you kind of you create this other parallel world where the people who we pay to actually fix the things that they're meant to fix, the basic things that they're meant to fix, get absolved, if you want to call it that, from doing so. And so we ourselves are beginning to take charge and saying, okay, let's do it. And for me, in our storytelling, we need to be quite nuanced in understanding, that why is that the case and who gets to do what about it. So the second thing I think I want to talk about is it's quite important, and with journalism, we always talk about journalism as a mechanism of truth. And I think it's important for us to understand deeper issues of fact checking. So while, going beyond just, fact checking as far as, did I quote the person right? Is their name correct? Etc. But I think we need to be able to develop strategies where we are able to fact check, perhaps not even in real time. It would be perfect if we were to do it in real time, but where we are able to actually fact check, what politicians say, what people in authority say, just beyond that, and to look at what exactly is, the books are saying. So when a politician, for example, stands up and say, okay, right, so we're going to fix whatever kind of roads, or pointing to the other person to say this has not been done. What is really the situation, on the ground beyond what they're saying? What is the Auditor General's books are saying? What is the impact reports basically are saying? And to be able to juxtapose that, with what they say with actually the reality on the ground, as well as the capacity, financial capacity, administrative capacity of the institutions that they want to lead. And I think part of the challenge that many of us have is really kind of doing hit and run journalism, where yes, we go, we follow, you know, the politician, we write what they say, or you know, record what they say, and then we kind of move on. And that is basically what our journalism offers. And I think our audiences are wanting something far more nuanced, something far more of quality. They want to know that what so-and-so is saying is actually true or not true, because this is what the reality is as far as, you know, administrative capacity. This is what the reality is as far as, you know, the political context, as well as, you know, what the municipality should be doing. And I think if we are able to arm ourselves with that kind of you know, information, we'll be able to ask better questions and report with such authority on matters of local government. But that does need a lot of reading. It needs a lot of reading, it needs a lot of planning, and for us to really think long and hard about how we cover the places that we want to cover. And I think the third thing for me is, and it's really part of our experiences, particularly as female journalists, is we need to know how to propaganda-proof ourselves, if there is such a you know, a phrase. So in my experience, a lot of, I mean, election time, and this happens, I suppose, all over the world, you know, election time are really that particular time where, you know, the biggest weapon that politicians or people vying for power, they have against each other is really propaganda. And obviously journalists, you know, being leading the platforms that we do, we really sometimes get caught up, you know, in that. And the question for me to ask is, how do we keep the main thing the main thing? You know, while it may be interesting to kind of talk about all the political machinations that happen, yes, perhaps there are context, but how do we make sure that what we write is fact-checked, it is true, is reality, particularly in a time of fake news? And I think these are conversations we probably need to have, you know, in the different newsrooms. And how do we, I think there is a webinar coming up from SANEF about particularly this kind of thing. And I think the important thing about it is that once you are able to, you know, to cut through the noise, you know, as it were, you're really able to tell a story in a way that is valuable, that your readers or your audiences may be able to follow and actually, you know, tell their own experiences as far as it, you know, it is concerned. And I think the other thing is, and just also kind of flowing from this issue of propaganda, is safety. I think many of us as journalists, in particular female journalists, again, at the time when there are elections coming up, we become, you know, targets for all sorts of attacks, whether it's attacks, yes, virtually, but also whether it's sometimes physical attacks. And a lot of journalists sometimes don't quite know how to navigate that. I think there is on our portal some tips on basically how to keep safe, you know, as we are covering. But I think as a major theme, you know, that is one of the things that we need to be able to be aware of and train ourselves, to say, this is how, you know, we are able to navigate what it becomes a very, very dangerous terrain for many, particularly young. The point really for me, I think, is to understand in this coming up election, while, you know, every single time we cover elections, you know, it happens at a time where, you know, there's high tensions and all of that. But I think for me, it's quite important for us to really try to keep the main thing, to really try to keep, to cut through what is essentially the noise and understand, particularly because our country finds itself in the position that it is, to understand what it is that is our role. And our role is to tell a story, to mirror the experiences of people above the claims of politicians. Our role is to fact check, you know, what people are saying against the reality on the ground, against what is there, what is documented, you know, in municipal records, etc. And I think our story is to be able to simplify those things and hopefully create an environment where people themselves are able to tell their own story. Hopefully create an environment where there are far more constructive conversations that are had about our local government than what we currently are facing now. Thank you, guys.
From Sinisipo Schreiber to the panelist, panelist singular. sorry to interrupt you, Judy. What are we doing wrong as young journalists? Secondly, how do we balance pressure and the responsibility to read and educate ourselves as general reporters? So if anyone wants to answer that, sorry for the interruption. Let's came in a little late as you started speaking.
No, I think that's a very important issue, because I just wanted to make one more statement in that it's never been more important to have good, accurate and fair reporting, and it's never been more under threat. So with that, let's go to the panel for answers.
Anyone?
I try first, Stan.
Thank you, Angie.
Just a quick one. Sinesipho, I don't think that you're doing anything wrong as young journalists. All of us were young journalists. We went through the ropes. We worked really hard. We're still trying to work hard. We are on point on certain moments and days, and then we lose it. But we're all here, and it's spaces like this where, I mean, Adrian and Nwabisa and I didn't chat about what we're going to talk about today. We got a brief, and I think we segued quite nicely into each other. But we all have the fundamentals. We've learned that. We practice the craft at every opportunity, even if we move from journalists to editors. So keep on doing your best, work at it. Number one, how do you balance the pressure and responsibility? The pressure and responsibility never goes away. I'm probably the worst person to ask that, because I live work more than I live life and all the other things. But find those moments that are just going to make you a full rounded human being and the best possible journalist that you can be.
Nwabisa?
Absolutely, I agree with Angie. I think for me, just to simplify it, since I wouldn't even say what we're doing wrong. I just think that we probably need to ask more of a question or two questions: why and how do you know? I think that we get, fed a lot of information, and I think in the excitement of trying to, get a story and get a story out, perhaps the lapses that do happen really have to do with the fact that we may not ask why, this is so, and how do you know this is so. And the thing about it for me is really to be able to, as we've said the whole day, is really to be able to fact check things that regardless of where they come from. The fact that, this source who told me this is somebody that I trust may not necessarily be enough to say, okay, let's go with it. It needs to be verifiable. And that's the thing about journalism. It's just, we always talk about how it's the art of verification. So why and how do we know?
Thank you very much, Adrian.
Just to briefly add to that, to what Nwabisa just said, I think specifically when it comes to political parties, you don't have to rely on political parties to tell you what's going on in elections, specifically with election results. You can go check for yourself. So if a political party tells you they're in front or they're going to win, or whatever, go and check it. The data is there for yourself, and that kind of fits into the second part of your question. How do you educate yourself? Read. Go and read books about election coverage. Go and read the IEC website, and go and speak to the wonderful people at the IEC and in the media fraternity who's covered many elections. I mean, that's literally the only way.
Thank you very much, everybody. Over to Judy. As you can see, there's a wealth of information, and the wonderful portal that SANEF has compiled and put together. There's no shortage of resources, no shortage of references, of archives, of what has gone before. So thank you very much, everybody, and well done, SANEF, for putting together these training tutorials. They're most welcome in trying to make sense of covering the elections. Over to you again, Judy, and thank you, everybody.
A special thank you to our panelists. That's Angie, Adrian, and Nwabisa, and also to you, Amina. A special thank you for chairing it so ably, as well as to Isak and Mary for putting this together and driving the project. And not to forget our SANEF office, our ED, Reggie, and Hopewell and Zudzi, who've all worked so hard, and the people who've hosted this for us. Just on a more personal note, in terms of being a young journalist, I think, as you know, it's a very exhausting career. It never stops, especially with news being going across all platforms, and something you always have to keep feeding. I would just suggest try to have a hobby that you can enjoy, that can help you recharge your batteries to try and enable some balance in your life occasionally. It's a constant challenge. But for example, running or climbing mountains. I found climbing a mountain in the Drakensberg helped me a lot in grounding myself when I got very frustrated with or exhausted from reporting challenges. So all I would say to all of you, take care and stay safe. We need you more than ever. We need your talent, your skills, your dedication to tell the stories of South African people for South Africa and help hold all the major players to account. So thanks again, everybody who's contributed to this seminar. Keep an eye on the SANEF website for more workshops coming up, and that will help empower you. Share the word with your friends. Everyone is welcome.